Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this Waymark webinar. We're just going to wait another minute or two just to see more people joining the webinar. So we're just going to wait about a minute or two for a few more people to join, and then we'll get started. Okay, I've seen a few more people join. I suspect a few more will join a little bit late, but as I'm the least interesting person on this webinar, we can get started. So thank you, hello, and welcome to everyone to our webinar on compliance in the age of hybrid and remote working. My name is Mark Harding. I'm the sales director here at Waymark. This isn't a product webinar, but what we are listening to is expert speakers who have helped to shape our own thinking about compliance and RegTech. The agenda is first of all going to be introductions from our key speakers. We've got David Cowland, who's an independent RegTech advisor and been a long-term advisor to Waymark. We've got Mark Holmes, who is the CEO and founder of Waymark after a background in financial services. And we've got Katie Stephen, who's a dispute resolution lawyer for Norton Fulbright. So we're going to be starting with introductions from them. Then we're going to move over to a Q&A. Throughout the webinar, I'd encourage you to ask any questions in the attendee chat. We have some set questions in the Q&A roundtable, but as you come up with more questions, please post them in the attendee chat, and if we've got time, we will pose those to the speakers. Similarly, if you have any technical issues or any other questions, please also post them in the attendee chat, and we will get onto them that way. All attendees are on mute, so you'll just be able to hear the speakers at the time. And finally, this webinar is being recorded, and at the end of it, you'll be able to access the recording via the same link as the event. Now I'll hand over to Mark to do a short introduction to himself.
Thanks, Mark. So as introduced, my name is Mark Holmes. I'm the CEO and founder of Waymark Tech. So I just wanted to echo Mark's earlier sentiments and welcome you to this webinar. The pandemic has changed our way of life, not least in the way we work, and shown that one size does not fit all when it comes to balancing work and personal lives. As we come out of lockdowns, we're not seeing a return to the old normal. Businesses are changing their models and continuing to experiment. And we're seeing three approaches emerge. Firstly is full flexibility. In June this year, Deloitte announced that they were giving all 20,000 UK employees the ability to choose where they work permanently. Secondly, office first. Firms like JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs have been very clear that office life is core to their business model, and so will predominate. And thirdly, a hybrid approach, adopted in the middle ground, with remote working supported for a few days each week for many or all of their staff. Now, I'm not here to opine on which is best. There may be no perfect model and no one-size-fits-all solution. Each model has its pros and cons. However, caught in the middle of these debates are the stressed people in the compliance department. Working remotely to any degree presents a host of regulatory challenges that many firms are not yet addressing properly. So I'm going to touch on three of these key areas: data and privacy, cybersecurity, and conflicts of interest. So the first regulatory challenge relates to data and privacy, starting with employee privacy. Some managers worry about productivity, and surveys report that 1 in 5 firms plan to monitor staff as they work from home. Aside from the obvious trust issues here, these businesses could be in breach of GDPR and liable to any damage suffered by their workers as a result of a breach by effectively spying on their staff. Regarding privacy more generally, employees working remotely multiplies the endpoints coming into the system. This in turn multiplies the risk, as it can be hard for the employee and the organization to know when the data is breached, and it'll be even harder to identify how it happened. Most remote workers will have to move data or devices into public or quasi-public spaces such as shared accommodation. That opens up the risk of devices or data being mislaid. Many breaches have occurred from documents being left on trains, USB sticks falling out of pockets, or laptops being stolen. Although it's hard to stop devices being mislaid, there are ways to mitigate the damage if this happens. For instance, setting strict access rights on devices and systems that those devices access. My last point on privacy is that cross-border transfers of data are yet another issue. Firms are liable to educate themselves on the legalities of sharing data with employees situated around the world, as well as global clients. So moving on to cybersecurity. Regardless of where people work, companies have to maintain security standards. This is challenging when data is moving back and forth between offices and remote employees and devices. With the increased number and diversity of endpoints in the system, there are higher risks of breaches. Added to this is the fact that many employees are allowed to use their own devices and software. Many businesses are aware of these risks, but few seem to have done much about it. Research shows that 41% admit their remote working strategies may be in breach of data protection regulations, and 45% expect a breach due to staff using devices which are not fully protected. The traditional castle and moat approach employed in the office is no longer applicable in these circumstances. So it's imperative that all ingress and egress points are identified and secured in this newly expanded network. Adopting a zero trust strategy is not optional. It's a new business imperative. People and organizations need to have trust in the technologies that bring them together. The term zero trust may feel like the opposite of that, but when you assume breach and provide the least privileged access necessary, it actually empowers employees with the flexibility and freedom they want. The hybrid world is largely perimeterless, so wrapping protections around identity and devices is critical. Cybersecurity also depends on the individual, with 1 in 5 breaches caused by human error and ignorance. So organizations must educate and support staff, expand help desk support, and drive a culture where it's okay to flag concerns. Lastly, conflicts of interest, or side hustle syndrome, as we like to call it. Remote working can stimulate an employee's entrepreneurial streak, providing the opportunity to start or develop their side hustle. Now, this is not problematic in itself. As an entrepreneur, I encourage it. But unclear guidance or inconsistent application of the rules regarding personal conflicts are problematic and can be damaging for both the organization and the employee involved. So the challenges are serious, and the message from regulators is also very clear. As Julia Hoggett said, our expectation is that going forward, office and working from home arrangements should be equivalent. firms need to be as vigilant as they were in the office at home as well. And this places pressure on compliance functions and accountable executives in times of tough cost controls. There's no easy solution here to these challenges, but RegTech is one of them. And I'm sure we'll touch on the possible use of technology later on in the webinar. So I'm going to finish there, as I'm sure you prefer to hear from our guest speakers today. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to David. David, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mark. That was a great introduction to, I think, some of the top things that we're going to talk about today on the webinar. Yeah, David Cowland here. Spent a lot of time in that RegTech space and still advise a lot of clients, a lot of vendors on the RegTech space. So I'm going to cross over some of Mark's stuff because I think, just part of my intro, I think, you know, the pandemic has brought that extraordinary change that Mark was talking about, and all across global businesses in terms of how we're going to work. If you cast your mind back to 2019, working from home 1 day a week had become, you know, reasonably ubiquitous for most office-based companies, but that was it. You were expected to be in the office for the other 4 days. No one thought that working from home for more days was ever going to work. And so therefore the ability to remain compliant and hit all those regulatory needs was a lot easier. One day from home was, you know, was pretty okay. Then the pandemic hits and it kind of rewrites the way that we do everything. And it turns out that we can work for long periods of time at home without affecting productivity. The technology has come on substantially. Workers can work as if they're in the office without any sort of lag or latency drops in terms of how they're processing things. And in many cases, and with some roles, people have found that productivity has gone up as the distractions have gone down. So, you know, very interesting to see how that's taken place over the last 18 months. Business travel has reduced to almost zero. So have sort of face-to-face conferences. I mean, that's had a beneficial effect in terms of obviously reducing carbon emissions. Now something that companies are having to be very aware of in terms of their ESG credentials. And in fact, generally, we know with journeys going down, carbon emissions. I mean, I think in terms of my own car, I think I've halved the mileage I've travelled in the last 18 months. Thankfully, technology advances in video conferencing have got to a level where the remote calls and the conference calls have been phenomenally successful, and the features have helped keep industry going. But now we're coming to the end of the current restrictions, hopefully not to be repeated, but we will see. And now we have to adjust how we move forward. Articles on the future of working seem to be coming out almost on a weekly basis now. The question seems to be around, you know, how much time we're going to spend in the office versus remote working. A recent poll showed that 15% wanted to be back in the office permanently, while another 15% wanted to work from home permanently. That's about a third of your workforce. So you're always going to have both ends of the spectrum. Those with vested interest are clearly looking for a return to, you know, closer to the old way of working, whereas many of the UK's largest companies have already said that hybrid working will be the new normal. So on the basis that, you know, we're going to be probably remote working anywhere from 2 to 3, you know, days per week, we've got to look at what the benefits are and what the issues are. Number of benefits clearly to a number of workers, especially those who have lots of needs at home. You know, you've got the ongoing reduction in carbon emissions, businesses shrinking their footprint, making savings internally. But on the other side, and this is where a lot of our discussion I think will go, there's lots of issues to resolve. You've got the whole problem of office occupancy. If your entire workforce turns up for work between a Tuesday and a Thursday and you've reduced your footprint, where's everyone going to sit? And especially in sort of like compliance and regulatory needs, making sure that those people are separated in terms of, you know, a lot of compliance teams sit in their own special offices. And I think some of the key there will be, you know, making it truly flexible so that we don't all have Monday and Friday from home. And as social animals, we clearly need to interact. So we're going to get a lot more of, you know, the need for sort of team days and people to be in the office. so that we can sort of like generate that sort of those ideas. And then of course we get to our sort of regulatory obligations, and coming specifically from the financial services sector, I think the need to remain compliant. You know, you think about communications and trade surveillance, and all the needs around that in terms of insider trading, especially on the buy side, data security and privacy, as Mark talked about, and cybersecurity. You've got your regulatory horizon scanning and obligations, risk management, operational resilience. And I think what's happened here is the hybrid way of working has exposed the flaws in our current processes, the reliance on individuals, the need to pass things across the desk, ubiquitous spreadsheet use, lack of automation. All of this tends to push us towards going to the office at the same time as organizations are saying, no, it's okay, you can now work from home. So I think, you know, RegTech's been around for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, even more now, a decade, and it's been offering a lot of these solutions. But I think wholesale adoption has been lacking, along with a clear strategy of how we tie RegTech into the end-to-end user journey. So, you know, with hybrid working here, I think it's a fantastic opportunity to really adopt some of the benefits of RegTech across that regulatory and compliance landscape. But there are many, many issues that we need to resolve, you know, regulatory and compliance, legal and cultural. And I think now what we'll do is we'll pass across to Katie, who will explore for us some of those issues that we are starting to see. Over to you, Katie.
Oh, great. Thanks, David. And good afternoon, everybody. I think, as Mark said, I spend my life trying to help firms that are facing challenges in terms of investigations and inquiries by the regulator. And so I thought what might be interesting is to spend a little time touching on some of the areas where firms have really faced challenges during the pandemic in terms of remote working, because I think, as everybody has said, you know, this is not going to go back in the box. Everybody's going to want to continue with some element of remote working. And so some of those challenges are going to continue, and it's also going to throw up, you know, new risks and ways of working that are going to have to be thought through by the compliance team and those who are trying to think about how to keep firms safe. And so it's worth looking at how firms have managed that challenge during the pandemic in terms of risk to individuals, how they manage the risk to firms, and then, you know, when I get involved when something goes wrong. So I think one of the biggest things we've seen is the sort of acceleration of the use of lots of different ways of communicating. You know, but before the pandemic, many of us had not used Zoom, or, you know, we were starting to adopt things like Skype, but we may not have used Teams. Now we're on all these different platforms. They all have different functionality, different chat ways of communicating, different methods of recording communications. You know, there are lots of apps like WhatsApp where people can communicate, and the move to working more from home has just accelerated that and has increased the use of those sort of more informal ways of communicating. And it's those sort of channels that I think we've seen giving rise to some issues, because people don't communicate on those on WhatsApp, for example, in the same way as they would if they were writing a more formal letter. You know, it goes back to the days when email was first introduced, and, you know, that was the new kid on the block, and people weren't as formal in their emails. And so when the regulator comes and they're looking to find out what went wrong, they, you know, in the old days, they wanted to look at everybody's emails. Now they want to look at the instant messages. They want to look at the WhatsApp messages, because that's where they think they're going to find out what's really going on. And surprisingly, perhaps, you know, people are not aware that they could be asked to hand over their messages, that these could be reviewed, that you know, somebody might want to trawl through them and look to see you know, what evidence there is in them. And the other thing that we've seen is that people are mixing much more their work and their social communications. So disentangling all of that after the event has become a real challenge. If somebody is using WhatsApp for both work and personal with an individual, then if they're asked to hand over work-related messages, trying to pull those out of a chain or work out which ones are relevant and which ones aren't is really challenging. Similarly, where people are using different email addresses, where they're using a home email address and a work email address, you've got all of those issues of having to trawl through a lot more data. And it's surprising how sometimes people may not appreciate that they should be taking the same care over their work communications that they're using in these more informal channels as they should in their emails or other written documents. And I think the other thing is that we've seen the regulator taking action against people now based on the contents of these sorts of messages. There was a case involving WhatsApp messages where somebody had sent some confidential client information to a friend. The regulator took a very dim view of that. That they were essentially showing off to their friends, but they had provided confidential information, and the fact that it wasn't inside information didn't mean that they weren't susceptible to a regulatory penalty. And the FCA has really been putting out a lot of messages around this, and they've also been making it clear that they expect firms to be adapting their policies and procedures to keep pace with this change in terms of the use of informal methods of communication. So although the FCA recognizes that the pandemic has had an impact on the way that firms do business and the way that individuals communicate, the message from the regulator is very much, well, the recording requirements in the regulations remain the same. You need to be making sure that your policies and procedures, your monitoring, your surveillance has kept pace with that, and that they're up to date. And in particular, that you are recording the communications that you need to record. So firms need to be thinking about, how are our staff communicating? Are they communicating in the right ways? Are we happy with the way that they're doing that? Are we recording things where we should be recording them? Would we be able to monitor these communications? Would we be able to produce them if we had to? Would we be able to run searches? And it's not just having policies and procedures, it's also training your staff to make sure that they understand what the policies are, and that, not just that there's something buried on page 694 of a huge manual, that actually things have been brought to the attention of staff, that they've been given practical guidance about how to implement the policies and procedures, that they know the ways in which they can communicate and the ways in which they can't communicate, that this flows right through the organization. We've seen, for example, people joining new firms and just picking up practices from the way that they see others operating around them. If they see that their bosses are all using WhatsApp to communicate, the fact that it says in the policy that people shouldn't be using WhatsApp isn't necessarily going to stop them. So you've got to really think practically about, what you see happening and how best to address the risks that poses for your business, because that's what the FCA is expecting you to do. And they've put out very clear markers that, that this will be a focus for them going forward, and that where firms haven't complied, that there could be action taken. I think the last thing that I just wanted to mention was sort of, and I've touched on it a little bit already, was what happens when things go wrong. So we've seen this proliferation of data, people using all these different channels to communicate. Firms are now gathering a lot more data. They have all of these technologies at their disposal. This means that when you come to do an internal investigation, or a third party comes, you know, a regulator or some authority comes and asks you for data, that you have a lot more data that you could potentially access and hand over. And grappling with all of that is an enormous challenge. So, you know, gone are the days where you could just review a few emails and look at a few files. You know, you've now got to think about, well, what personal devices do people have? Where might they have recorded things? Do they have bring your own devices? What policies do we have that enable us to get access to that information? You know, what searches can we run? You know, how are we going to address these issues that have been raised, and how are we going to show that we've done a thorough review of what's happened? And it's been touched on already, but data privacy is obviously key there. You know, lots of tangled issues around reviewing people's personal data, especially, as I've said, there's this mixture of the work and the social. And how are you going to manage a review when, you know, that a lot of those communications are going to be muddled together? And that really requires some careful thought, and it needs to be approached extremely carefully with the benefit of some advice. So I think that's all I wanted to say, just by way of introduction of some of the sort of challenges that we've seen individuals and firms grappling with. I think I'll now hand back to Mark.
Thank you. Some very interesting points there. I'm sure many of which are familiar with the people on the webinar. The accelerated pace of change towards hybrid and remote working is familiar to everyone. The challenges that brings with personal devices, the fact that there is no one size fits all in terms of technology to resolve the issue, and that businesses are having to be as vigilant these days, regardless of where the people are working from. So we're going to go into a bit of a Q&A now, bit of a roundtable chat, where it's going to be interactive between our speakers. I'll be chairing it, so just directing questions. Please ask any more questions. We've already had some questions come up in our attendee chat, so if any more come to mind, please ask away. So the first question that we're going to have is regarding RegTech specifically, and the changing pace of businesses at the moment in terms of this remote and hybrid working. How is RegTech keeping pace, and how is it meeting this challenge, Mark Holmes?
Hi there, hopefully you can hear me. So yeah, good question. The adoption of technology we've seen in the market has really been picking up pace. As people have realized, you know, that working from home is now, you know, part of the roadmap and their working model. The use of technology in more those back office functions has accelerated, and that digital transformation journey of, you know, compliance has really sort of grown and evolved at a rapid pace. What we've seen also, you know, is the number of regulatory obligations coming from the regulators has also increased throughout this time. So there has been this change in need to reprioritize internally. And actually, just to quote a recent report that, done in June by the FCA, where they did a survey, you know, this demand for RegTech solutions has remained stable at 52%, or has actually increased 43%, with a shared expectation amongst the industry that RegTech will be more firmly established as a trusted partner following the end of the crisis. So we're certainly seeing that increase and uptick in RegTech, and certainly in certain key use cases, we are seeing that uptick as well, as I mentioned, due to increased regulatory obligations that people need to stay on top of, or it might be more in the financial crime area.
Very interesting. Thank you, Mark. I think we'll tying onto that and asking really what advice would you offer firms that are facing these challenges, David?
So I've said this many times before, and to echo what Mark said, I think the RegTech industry is doing very well. It's got many of the solutions that organisations need. Personally, I think the issue sits within the organisations themselves in terms of how they understand what regulatory technology can offer them. And I think if I'm offering advice, there's two bits I sort of tend to say. There's your immediate problem. Often you've got a compliance issue or a regulatory issue. You've got the regulator breathing down your neck or someone breathing down your neck to sort something out. Communication surveillance, horizon scanning, whatever it happens to be, you've got an immediate problem and you have to focus on that problem and you have to get that problem resolved. So you do need to keep your eye on that. But this user journey goes horizontal. It's not siloed. So if you look at communication surveillance, it's inextricably linked to, say, trade surveillance and to regulatory reporting. So you've got to keep one eye on the strategy. So I think that's what you kind of need. Yes, you need problems sorted out, but don't go down the route of putting in 15 siloed applications to try and solve all your regulatory problems, and then find yourself with the next problem, which is how you're going to tie all those together. And think about your users. They're the ones who've got to log on to all those 15 applications, right? As you think, oh yeah, I've solved all my problems, got 15 applications. That's not going to be easy. So you've got to think about that user journey. You've got to solve the problem that's immediately in front of you, but you've got to be able to look up and look at the overall RegTech strategy and how you're going to tie all this stuff together in the longer term.
Thanks, David. Katie, I think I'm going to give you an opportunity to come in and talk from a legal perspective about those topics. Apologies, we seem to be having technical issues with Katie. Hopefully she can rejoin us, as we're very interested to hear what she's got to say. So we may go back to that in a minute when Katie's back. More on the topic of AI and machine learning, obviously hot topics in RegTech. Are those the answer to all of our problems? Are those going to solve all of them, or are they going to create some more challenges, perhaps challenges we haven't even thought of? So Mark, I'd like to answer
that. So yeah, obviously hot topic, and has been for a little while now. The talk of AI and machine learning coming to either take your jobs away and replace the workforce, or be the answer to everything, has been around for a little while. So there's definitely been sort of education on that side. AI, machine learning, is still, I would say, in its nascent stages. We've seen great development, and as an AI company ourselves in the natural language processing space, the speed of the area moving forward has been phenomenal in what can be achieved. I don't think it's the answer to all problems. There is still, especially within a compliance space, there are still questions that people ask around transparency, and actually, how can we know what's happening within the AI? And so this question of AI transparency is a very key question, and everything that we do and how we build is to ensure that transparency. Look, we are seeing, though, huge increase in adoption of the technology as that trust is built up. in what the systems can do, the accuracy, the speed with which it can do, and it's that trade-off between that and sort of more manual ways. So that's sort of my side of the story. I think it'd be good to hear from the practitioners themselves about, you know, what their concerns are when they're looking to choose AI.
Okay, I think it's a good question for David, first of all, and I think we've got Katie back, so then we'll hear from her.
So yeah, AI clearly it is on its way. It's come over the horizon. It's on everyone's radar. It has a very clear ability to start solving some of the big problems in the compliance and regulatory space. You think about the amount of regulation that's coming over the fence and the need to sort through all that regulation. You think about all the false alerts that you get from communication surveillance. You think about the need to start linking pieces of data, often alphabetical data rather than numerical data, across an organization, between communication surveillance, trade surveillance, security, cultural aspects. AI is going to solve all that. It will solve all that. The problem is, like anything that comes along that's new, it has its own set of issues that we need to think about. So Mark covered some of them. Transparency. It has to be clear. It cannot be a black box. We have to be so careful with the data and the data models that we are not prejudicing certain individuals in society. And that's one of the biggest issues. Tech's got lots of challenges. Yes, they can build it, and they can probably build it quite easily. Some very clever people out there. But tech's got to put the frameworks in place to understand how these things are being built, the ethical standards. And I think, from a practitioner's point of view, when I was building them with my team, we built those transparency in so people could see the false alerts. Because you've got to think about the regulator coming along as well. The regulator comes along and says, "Oh, so you think you only have 15 items to review. How many did you have originally? 30,000. How did you get from 30,000 to 15? Please show me." So you've got to be able to sort of like show that and be clear. And so from a big firm perspective, asking a vendor, demonstrate to me how this works, but also knowing that your regulator will step in at some point and say, prove to me that you've only actually got 15 real alerts. So there's a lot of stuff to do here. I think it is a lot of the answer once we get the technology aligned along the user journey, automation. You've got it looking across multiple applications, picking up the data, picking up things that are going on that you can't even think about as a human being. But we've just got to have that transparency. We've got to be clear with the ethics. We've got to make sure the data models and the model drift is all being aligned nicely. So that it's transparent to the regulators when they eventually turn up and say to you, prove to me that this does actually work properly.
Okay, I think we do have Katie back. Hopefully, we seem to be having our own technology issues today, but I think we've got Katie back, so it'd be good to get your thoughts on what you've heard so far, Katie.
Mark. Yeah, I mean, I agree with what's been said. I think one of the key things for me, and people have touched on it already, is getting the two sides to match up. So, the technology is great, but only if the people using it sort of understand it, and the people who are bringing it to you understand what your business needs. I've had lots of situations where people go, "Oh, we've got a great piece of technology that's going to solve all your problems." But actually, if the people on the IT side don't speak your language and you don't understand enough of what they're saying, everything falls in the middle. So you can't just go, "Well, we're going to apply this bit of technology and it's going to solve everything." And the regulator definitely is expecting you to think about your business. What you know, you can't just buy off the shelf, for example, a series of alerts and apply them and think it's going to do the job. You know, the regulator's expecting you to make that bespoke to your business. So you've got to think about, what risks does my business face? What scenarios are my employees going to be in? And how can I best use this technology to meet those challenges? And you've got to go through that sort of hard thinking, and then you've got to get the two pieces to match up together so that the technology is actually helping you, you know, in the context of the particular business that you're in, and there isn't something that's fallen down the gap because one group of people assumed that the technology was going to do that, and the people who were operating the technology didn't know that everybody was expecting it to do that. So surveillance is one of those areas. You know, running search terms, that sort of thing, is another example. It's making the best use of these tools, but in a way that matches with your business. And it's the same with the remote and the hybrid working. You know, that requires firms to sit and think about, well, if half of our people are in the office and half of our people are out of the office, and these roles, what does that mean for them? You know, what are the particular risks that could throw out? You know, whether that's more hot desking, more confidential information backwards and forwards. You've got to identify those risk scenarios, and then you've got to think, well, what controls can we put in place to address those risks? And part of that answer is going to be technology, but it's technology applied in a sort of way. Mark, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Katie. Glad we got you back. Going to ask an audience question now. If firms are allowed to use their personal IT equipment, either permanently or until work equipment was provided, how will they be able to ensure all client or firm data has been accounted for without asking to inspect personal assets? Tying into, I guess, something that Mark mentioned earlier, is trust enough? So I guess, Mark, maybe you can expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So I agree that firms need to ensure that they put in place as many security points as possible. You know, things such as the organization should present the minimum services and data to staff using their own devices by adjusting those permissions and service access policies that I mentioned. Taking a serious approach to user authentication can also help, ensuring that multi-factor authentication has been deployed alongside usual corporate credentials. Potentially using risk-based authentication adds another layer of protection for personal devices. So this is where it works by granting or denying access based on meta-identity, such as the type of device or the location of the device being used and other request information. So then if suspicious activity is identified, alerts can be raised. But there is no substitute for IT teams keeping their ears to the ground in terms of the services and data being accessed. So by keeping records of logins or failed authentications and other requests can give you meaningful ways of identifying behavior that might compromise your network security. And then there's obviously the general risks of a bring your own device culture. It's very important to ensure that your BYOD policy is very clearly stated and also very clearly communicated, and that staff are fully aware of those risks, of those procedures, and sort of the consequences of them. David, I don't know if you've got anything further to add to that, or Katie as well.
Yeah, I think from my experience, it depends on the size of the firm. So big firms, you know, if you pop down to, if you're in a big firm, they've probably got a cyber defense office somewhere in the building. If you pop down there and sort of spend a bit of time with them, you'll see that, you know, your firewall is being peppered on a, you know, minute by minute basis from various hackers and whatever, just trying to get past your firewall. So, you know, it's a real eye opener when you go and see that. And I think again, in big companies, they're starting to put that. It doesn't really matter if you've got a personal device, because they've got that dual authentication in via Citrix, VPN, however it's done, into your internal network. So as long as they're authenticating, there's not much that should be going down to your personal laptop. Very little, in fact. So there should be no data. No data should be able to be printed on your personal. No one should be printing anything anyway, apart from very, very few people. There's, you know, the tools now, you don't need to print anymore. So most organizations will say that, yeah, use your personal laptop, log into it effectively, your proxy, like logging into your desktop at work, and that offers you a fair amount of security. I think the smaller the firms get, the harder it becomes, right? Because they don't have that level, and I think that's where the problem comes. But this is going to be the issue of our decade, by the looks of it, with hybrid working, remote working, data privacy issues, cyber security, how we protect clients' data and protect individuals is going to be the journey we are going to go on for the next 10 years at least.
Many thanks, David, and thank you very much to our speakers. I'm sorry, but we seem to have run out of time. I know I was finding it interesting. We had some more questions we were going to ask. If there's any audience questions we didn't get to, we will get some response sent to you directly. As I mentioned, this webinar was recorded, so you'll be able to access that via the link for the webinar to rewatch it, or if any of your colleagues want to watch it, they can as well. We will be running some similar webinars in future, so please look out for those. I'd certainly like to thank all of our attendees. We had them from all over the world, which some of you may be watching on holiday, second homes, just to tie in really to the hybrid working, remote working theme. So I want to thank everybody. Big thanks to our speakers, and look forward to seeing you all in the future. Take care.